Fair enough. There's an interesting dodge you can use, which I've seen some Roman Catholics who used to be Anglicans do. When they want to refer to some holy person in Anglican history, they will call him or her, blessed so-and-so, with a small b. Yes.
In that vein, thinking of our liturgical texts of with anathemas and so forth, I would be minded to just replace that with the dogmas that were rejected away. Mm-hmm. But I hear what you're saying. So is it kind of inverted commas we need to use around the names? Is that the kind of first step that we sort of say this represents not the personality? Mm-hmm. Is that, of course, in Christian charity, there is something quite profound about condemning someone. We're told not to attribute, to the devil things that are of the Holy Spirit and so forth. So if Severus is Saint Severus and indeed a holy man and so forth, that I have a liturgical text by which I have to pray and sing for his condemnation somehow is problematic on several levels, right? But if it's Severus, with air quotes, or whatever,
yes.
I don't know how you sing it that way, but
indeed,
but it's a first step anyway. Because in a published volume, people would see that, and it would at least invite the kind of thing that you do when you get a filioque. So it's not really a fully composed thought, but we're struggling with this, obviously.
Absolutely, and where I sympathize, say with what the monks of Mount Athos respond, right? Is that and of course, and the Ethiopian Church as well, they look at 1,500 years of holy people who have said those words, right? So the implication for them seems to be that if you delete now those anathemas, you're no longer condemning Severus, you're condemning the last abbot of this monastery, right? And
that is precisely the argument, even in the Christological debate and so forth, where people look at the committees that have decided this is done, and I completely accept. I think it is a matter of language and so forth. But of course, it's all the people that say, but now you're saying the fathers got it wrong. Right. So you think you're undoing something if you're actually creating another problem, which is condemning.
Obviously, I don't have a lot of skin in this game, except that of one who yearns for Christian unity. Where I rationalize it, I don't know if rationalize is the right word, where I see it as so necessary, at least to be desperately careful about how we approach this, and to take no steps at all until we're very sure about what the consequences will be. Right? We've handled 1,500 years of schism, so another 10 years may not be a big problem. Is to reach the understanding that the fathers who condemned this teacher or that teacher were right to do so. Because if they adopted the wordings proposed by those teachers, they themselves would fall into heresy, even if those teachers had not. Right? Like the whole point is that a Chalcedonian Christian cannot use the language of Severus. Right? And should not use the language of Severus, and therefore Severus needed to be opposed by that whole branch of the church. Right? And similarly, a Coptic Christian cannot use the language of Chalcedon, right? Needs to anathematize Leo or whoever it is, right? Because if they had adopted that language, they themselves would have fallen into heresy. And so, I feel like that's really what this is about. Again, my favorite Anglican theologian, F.D. Morris, he was a great defender of the Athanasian Creed as found in the Book of Common Prayer, which in the later 19th century was really giving people a lot of anxiety because it speaks about, if you don't hold these beliefs, you cannot be saved. Right? He who would be saved, let him thus hold the Catholic faith. And people wanted to drop it because they didn't want to be saying that people who could not subscribe to this creed were hopeless of salvation. Now, as Morris explained it, and indeed there were many other theologians like E.B. Pusey who explained it in a similar way. They said, I've never read the condemnations in the Athanasian Creed as addressed to anyone but me. Yeah. Right? He that would be saved, you saying this creed right now. Do you wish to be saved? This is addressed to you. It can only be addressed to believers. Right? And so to think of the anathemas in a similar way might be helpful. Right? To think of the anathemas as addressed to me if I am tempted to use the words of Severus out of courtesy, or out of a shallow desire for accommodation. If we could see them as addressed to ourselves rather than to someone else. And even to, if we could get some people from... unity will be achieved by cantors. You see, we need to get cantors from the separated traditions to come and sing at each other's liturgies in which they heartily, sing loudly the anathemas against their own saints, right? Because they recognize that in this liturgy, I have to say that. Otherwise, think of what St. Paul says, right? It's the weaker brother's conscience that you've got to guard. Right? If it's an eating or drinking or an anathemas. So, the strong cantor from the separated church who comes to assist at the liturgy, he will not damage the consciences of people who are there with refraining from singing the anathemas. He'll sing them with a special gusto.
But precisely because of his strength, I think, following Father Jeffrey, he must then be in a position and have a certain moral obligation then to revisit the question of the anathemas of the other in his own tradition, specifically when we can see that in very many instances they have led to moral consequences, such as in fact the persecution and victimization of other Christians. So to the extent that ideas in general have consequences, it seems that it may not be sufficient to put scare quotes around these words, not least because that suggests a cognitive dissonance in which we say one thing and mean something else.
Yeah.
Not even because if we put scare quotes around the things that we condemn, what if we end up having to do that around the things that we extol? That is, the people we extol as in some way responsible for, attached to positions that they may not in fact have been as, with which they may not have been as intimately associated. But it seems that we're simply kind of exonerating ourselves or passing the buck and saying that we're not going to take responsibility for the fact that people have misused or been misdirected by these texts and have done X, Y, Z. That's no concern of ours. We're simply going to preserve them out of a desire to preserve orthodoxy. Well, do we really want to preserve orthodoxy, or do you want to preserve the image of preserving orthodoxy? That's the thing
Well, when the cantors have agreed to sing each other's anathemas for 100 years or so, then I think we'll be in a position to evaluate that, right? It will have to come from a legitimate sense that orthodoxy is no longer at risk, right? I don't mind that converts to Roman Catholicism used to have to, sign an abjuration of all the wicked teachings of the Reformers, right? If you're going to be Roman Catholic, you have to do all of that, right? And nor did I mind that our clergy had to sign the 39 Articles of Religion in the past, all right? So even though, that's another area, right, where Catholic and Anglican dialogue is revealing, so what you were condemning is not what we were teaching, and what we were condemning is not what you were teaching, and so the forms of words actually turn out, even though they're quite stridently controversial, they turn out to be directed at different opponents. So again, it's not as personal as it is with the names of holy doctors and pastors, but yes. Yes.
I'm just curious, because you brought up the point about how liturgy really has to arise from the experience of the people. It's something that's lived, just like sit in a computer and write it. So I wonder if maybe then the problem is that we're worried so much about the liturgy and how do we do liturgy in a way that's not going to offend anybody. And instead, we should be thinking about how do we form the people so that we can have kind of a conversion among the people, and then from that we'll be able to find these liturgies that can embrace and come back ecumenical differences in a different way.
Father Jeffrey will be able to speak to this better than I can, because there was an idea that, hey, we just got to get liturgy right, and then our people will believe properly, and they will have proper faith and so on. It hasn't really worked out that way.
But I'm saying, should we then be inverting it? Should we should we be more worried with helping people understand that humanism actually is a threat, that that we should be building up these relationships among the people of different ecclesial communities, and then from that experience, then the new liturgies will arise. So we're not sitting in a committee room thinking about the new liturgies.
Yeah.
We're sitting in a committee room thinking about how to reform the people.
Sure. I think that it'll only be after the people are formed within their own tradition that it's even safe to start talking about, hey, we need to be friends with so and so, right? Because that people will get very confused. Yeah, as Lewis says, right? The ones who are closest to each other are the ones who are right at the center of the traditions. Sorry, Father Jeffrey. Yes.
Yeah, I was just to add to that, just a very good point. And that often means going back to the people and not to the isms that are attached to them. Because if I meet somebody who's really attached to Augustinianism, which has grotesque forms, but if you go to Augustine himself, you'll actually find he's one of the Greek fathers, as George Borowski said, right? Yeah. So, Lutherans are best served by going to Luther, Calvinists by going to Calvin, and so I encourage everybody to go back to the holy people at their core, because they are very close together, in my sense of that, as opposed to the isms which create these conflicts and everything. So Severus, Severianism or whatever, possibly not, and likewise on our side.
And if I just add, I suppose in the back of my head that I was not making explicit, and that's my fault, is that this would be sort of grounded in a way of having people in their own particularity, but in such a way that it's not kind of an us versus them. That you can be in your own identity without having to fight against everybody who's not you.
Yes, this exactly the point you've just made was brought up on Saturday at a conference I attended of the Anglican Orthodox Society, which is Anglicans who've gone to Rome and they have these personal ordinariates, and they were marking the 10th anniversary of the Apostolic Constitution that set them up. And the bishop of the North American Ordinariate, Stephen Lopes, he was talking about how when he first became bishop, he'd go and visit the different ordinariate parishes. And he said, it was not in any way discernible that there was one liturgy that was used here, right? Like everywhere had a different character and different way of doing things. And he said that has been softening now, I think, because it was no longer a case of, everybody in our church hates us and we've got to keep to these distinctive things that have preserved us, right? Now that we have unity, we can relax into a more generous expression of unity. Right? Now, I think, the ordinariate liturgies have missed the ball entirely with what Anglican identity is, but we'll leave that to one side. They can be their own thing. Yeah. Yes?
So I have two comments. One with regard to chanting of anathemas, and I would say with regard to that question, we should keep in mind that on the grassroots level, in places like Egypt and Syria, not only are the laity allowed to commune, well, in Syria, not in Egypt, in Syria, a Syriac Orthodox priest and an Ethiopian Orthodox priest are allowed to concelebrate all sacraments with the exception of the Eucharist. Now, these people chanting anathemas to each other after their forefathers while they're concelebrating mysteries of the church does not make a lot of sense. Not to mention that if we're worried about those who are simple and cannot, like the whole Pauline image that you used, then I think a third of my family, that is half Coptic, half Greek, living in Greece now, would rather attend their Sunday of Orthodoxy without hearing a bunch of anathemas. So these are things that need to be kept in mind. It's not simply the liturgy, it's the liturgy as the work of the people and for the people. So the people must be served with the lack of chanting of anathemas. A good way to do this is what North American bishops have done, which is they still have their books the way they are. They haven't changed anything about their books, but they don't chant the anathemas. Keep it there.
Listen, yeah, totally acceptable to me. Totally acceptable to me. One of the difficulties of Western liturgical revision has been the idea that everything has to be said all the time. And I'm not just talking about controversial things, right? I'm just like the monastic office, say, right? Getting through all 150 psalms in a week and all these readings and lots of prayers and all sorts of things, right? Very few people are in a position to do all of that, right? And one of the responses after Vatican II and the restructuring of the breviary was to make it small enough for a busy priest, right, to be able to fit all of it in. And that seems to me a really backward kind of idea, right? Instead, they should have said every priest is responsible for this portion of it, right? And any greater extent would be commendable but not required, right? And I think you can take that and sort of apply it to this, right? And say that as long as we are not deleting the texts, but rather, we didn't sing them today, right? Oh, gee, I forgot, right? Plausible deniability, right? Like I think that is a pastoral solution.
Yeah.
Who can gainsay it? Yes.
And regarding the Psalms, I think whoever that group is, they should look up to the Ethiopian monks who pray all 150 Psalms daily.
Yes. Yes.
Beside the point.
As Cassian says, was being done, by so many. Yes.
Now,
Yeah.
regarding the question of saints, I'm sorry to say, but many of us are infused with the disease of 19th century fundamentalism, which informs our understanding of saints to a large extent, because a look back at history can prove us all wrong with regard to how we see saints. For example, Jean Cassian, and a lot of churches in the West ended up being in the list of heretics, while he was considered a saint in the East, and he remained in communion for 500 years thereafter. The person of Dionysius the Areopagite, whoever he is believed by some scholars today to be actually someone who was in close connection with Severus of Antioch and his party, although he has much more influence in the Byzantine Church than he does in the Oriental Church. And finally, the Ethiopian Church in its synaxarium has someone like John of Damascus venerated as a saint, despite the fact he has choice words to say about Severus and his followers. So it's not as rigid as we might see it in terms of saints. People can go back and forth with the way they see saints, and that shouldn't be an obstacle for anything. I personally kind of have for different purposes, I have a dual citizenship in both churches, and due to my family, and as such, I don't feel weird going to a church that celebrates Leo, and I don't feel weird going to a church that celebrates the Vespers. This year's commemoration of the Fourth Ecumenical Council, I was attending a Greek parish. That did not stop me from fully enjoying the liturgy there. But one thing that helped is that the name of the Vespers wasn't mentioned. So I think it's being selective with what we say rather than omitting what is there.
How can I possibly add to what you said? Yeah, that's yes, it's an entirely sensible view. And as you say, it's one thing to be on the outside looking in and wondering, okay, well, how has this sort of thing worked out on our side? Quite another to be at the coalface. You remind me of an episode in the history of the Reformation when the works of a Protestant reformer were translated into Italian and published anonymously in Italy, and were read with pleasure and approbation by Catholic clergy and commended to people, and then the name of the author was revealed and the book was banned. Right? And so the point is a bit like what you've just said, right? That the important thing is to approve what has been written based on what's there, not the person who wrote it. And so if John of Damascus can be acclaimed a saint.
The Ethiopians love him for his love for the icons. It's not because of his Christological views. And you still call him Saint John.
Mm-hmm. A bit like the Empress Irene being a saint, for similar reasons.
Just to back up, another one of these isms versus the person, Pelagius. The only reason we have works of his preserved is because they were preserved throughout the Middle Ages under the name Augustine.
Yep.
And when they were discovered to have been actually by Pelagius, we had a completely new view of the man. Now, clearly, there is a heresy called Pelagianism, and it's awful. We must condemn that. But this poor British monk who lived a very holy life and whose works were preserved under his archenemy's name, go figure. Was that an unlooked or overlooked thing?
And yet, I get nervous whenever this comes up because the then presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church in the United States was asked whether, something or other that she'd said implied Pelagianism. And she said, well, I think we need to take another look at Pelagianism.
Is that the same one who said that the girl who lost her gifts?
Yes. So, again, like I'd like to keep the anathema for such persons. To guard simple souls like presiding bishops.
There are many bishops that are simple.
Oh gosh. Well, this has been a real delight and a scintillating presentation. Applause.